Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
Well, welcome back, Whole Pineapple listeners, to another snack edition. And we are doing kind of a birthday celebration today because we are coming up on the birthday of Louise Brown, the world's first IVF baby. She was born on July 25th, 1978. So we're recording this just before. Why is it a great day, Ruby?
Because it's my birthday too.
Yay! So yeah, you've got the July 25th. I've got the 1978. It's my birthday. So we're both very tied into Louise Brown, and we thought this would be a good time to do just a snack about it's interesting, I think, to see and think about what those initial cycles were like, because they are so different than the way we do IVF now, and sort of thinking about all the things that people went through to finally get to this first successful pregnancy. It's pretty amazing that anybody kept going at it, because you can really see these alternate scenarios where after so many failures, people would have just been like, well, I guess there's no way that we can make this proof of concept that we've seen in rabbits actually work in people. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. Like, what were these early cycles like?
In the terms of like medicine, IVF is pretty new, actually. And it's funny to remember that there was a time where we didn't even know egg and sperm existed, you know?
Yeah.
And, like, it's just like, we didn't know how it worked. We were like, well, we do this thing, and then 9 months later, a baby comes out. Bye. So the first was just like figuring out that we had sperm and eggs. Right.
And then trying to see if there's any way we could get them to fertilize outside the body. Mm-hmm. And it's fun reading some of these articles to realize, again, like, we didn't know how all this worked. And so in early studies, they really thought that for the sperm to be able to fertilize the egg, it had to be exposed to the female reproductive tract. So they were like getting sperm laparoscopically too, and then trying to put it together. And there's this really fascinating thing in one of the articles. So back in 1968, I don't know if you saw this, but I got a big exclamation point on my notes. Again, a lot of this stuff was happening where they would have people that had their ovaries removed. And they were this is all experimental. This was not to try and have anyone get pregnant. This is just literally doing research on egg and what eggs look like in the laboratory. And so they mentioned that they had ovarian tissue from an ovarectomy, and they were able to obtain 12 eggs from it. And then they say using their own sperm, 9 of the eggs were inseminated. Yeah. I was like, what? So all these early scientists are, again, most of these scientists were male, and they're like, I can make some sperm. Let's put it with the eggs and see what happens.
Yeah, that's an ongoing theme. Even back in the 1800s, when they first discovered sperm, the very first insemination was like, oh, this person didn't even know that she got inseminated with, like, oh, the best looking medical students. And it's like, it's terrible.
And this was all just research. No one was trying to use these eggs. These are people that were dumb, but this was more just proof of concept. Yeah. Like, if we put some sperm on these eggs, how can we possibly get them to fertilize? And so, yeah, we thought time for a little review back, and we could do hours and hours on this, but I think you and I both found some summary articles, and we just kind of talk about the things that jump out to us as maybe being the most surprising or the most applicable to our patients who might currently be in treatment now. The fact that we always talk about Louise Brown and we never talk about Lesley and Peter Brown, the couple that was actually going through all this effort. I mean, Louise was born, and that's great, and happy birthday, Louise Brown. But you know, we never really think about the women, especially, that were going through all this very invasive treatment cycles. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how invasive it used to be, even compared to how it is now. So we really have to do a shout out to Lesley. Oh, is that your thought?
Yeah. So it was that the cycle before the almost first IVF cycle, where it was like kind of on the down low kind of thing, where they like collected the eggs, and then the partner got in the cab and went to the fertility office and they were going to inseminate there. And then it got like the superior person at the hospital was like, nope, you can't do this. It's not regulated. So it was like quashed before we actually even did it. And it's like,
the lawsuit, right? Like at the end. So like in 1973, there was this lawsuit where they were putting sperm and egg together in the test tube, and then the like the head of the department basically said, "No, we're not going to do this. This is unethical." And so there was this whole thing going through. And again, who knows if this would have actually been successful? But the jury eventually found for the couple that the hospital had engaged in behavior that was utterly intolerable in civilized community. And then they awarded $50,000 to the woman and $3 to her husband, which I also find fascinating. Like, I don't quite understand. But anyway, this idea that, science was kind of working ahead, but there were still all these political and ethical concerns. And you're right. Sometimes the institutions would step in at various points and say, wait, maybe we shouldn't be doing this at all. And it's strange to think about that because IVF is such a sort of typical part of our society right now, but it's also still pretty recent, this acceptance. I mean, so Louise Brown is born in 1978, and then the couple actually had a second child also via IVF, and that second child in 1999 had her own successful spontaneous pregnancy, and that was kind of the first time that a lot of people were like, oh, okay. And then Louise Brown herself had a spontaneous pregnancy in 2006, and that was a big deal for a lot of people because there was this concern that if you're causing pregnancies via IVF, are you going to be creating this whole group of children that will be unable to reproduce without IVF? Because they just didn't really understand a lot of how this worked. And so being able to have the very famous first quote unquote test tube baby go on to conceive without needing scientific help was a really big step. And that was, again, 2006, not all that long ago.
Just the whole term test tube baby too is just like just shows the evolution of the language and everything too, because that sounds so Star Trek kind of level. Even in 1932, Brave New World, the novel, came out, and it actually described something very similar to IVF, and it was like kind of like a preview of this. And it's actually kind of, I remember reading this, and I don't remember much about the actual book, but I do remember that part. And it's kind of crazy that it actually predicted future events, kind of. But that's what people were fearful of, things like that, of the technology.
Right. There was a lot to overcome for sure. And, it's important to remember that this didn't all just magically happen in 1978. I mean, if you go back to season 1 and listen to our birth control pill episode, you realize all this early work that was happening with rabbits. And, this kind of was something that was really built on a lot, especially starting in the kind of 60s.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's the people that eventually kind of are credited with the success of IVF when we talk about Edwards and Steptoe. You also have the fact that they initially published some data in 1965, kind of showing how they were able to obtain human oocytes and occasionally get fertilization. And it was published in the Lancet, although it then responded that they did not see the point of the work. So these are all things that, definitely could have just stalled out at any point along the way.
Oh, for sure. And did you notice there's a lot of overlap in the people we talked about in our birth control episode?
Yes.
Like our like Mr. Dr. Rock.
Yeah, but we've got MC Chang, the first to report the birth of rabbit pups after successful IVF. Yeah. So yeah, all these players are doing stuff at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about like what was IVF, the way that these initial people were doing it, because that's the part that I think blows my mind.
Very interesting. Now we do everything via like vaginal egg retrieval with a sonographic monitoring. Then it was laparoscopic. So it was a surgery in your pelvis. So they're like directly looking at the ovary that way. That's where we have some really cool pictures of ovaries ovulating.
Can I read this description of a laparoscopic surgery? I love this. So it says, this is, again, as they've been modifying their technique. So this is like the great way to do it. It says, we simplified our laparoscopic oocyte retrieval technique by using 2 incisions, one for the operative scope with a port to insert the needle, the other to grasp forceps and stabilize the ovary. And finally, we attached a 5-pound TV camera to the laparoscope so the procedure could be better seen by the OR team. So we're like, yeah, this is high tech in the 1978s, a 5-pound have TV sitting there in the OR.
I'm going to totally age myself, but like back in the day when you're in like elementary school and you had a substitute teacher and they like rolled in the TV cart, like that's what I like picture them doing. And like, yes, it's movie day, and they roll in the big old cart into the OR.
And you're doing all this to try and chase one magical egg. That's the other thing. So when they were initially kind of trying to do this, they were doing a little bit more like what we would think of as our IVF cycles, where they were trying to stimulate the ovaries, but they didn't have any successes. They kept missing ovulation. And so they kind of recalibrated. And again, it shows you how science works, because I think it's more just that the whole process was so inefficient that they hadn't gotten lucky yet. But they decided, well, maybe the problem is we need to be more natural. And so that's when they decided to go to this idea of just tracking a natural, spontaneous cycle, trying to figure out when the LH surge happens and going in there and retrieve. And that really just kind of, I mean, honestly, I think it's just sort of luck of the draw that happened to be the cycle that was successful. And so then everybody was like, this is the magic. It must be natural cycle. And then you have like years of other people trying to replicate it and failing and being like, maybe we should try and grow more than one egg, and then figured out, oh, actually that can work too. But yeah, so the actual first successful implantation and ongoing pregnancy was this laparoscopic surgery to retrieve this one egg.
At the same time, as we talked about during the birth of the birth control pill, is like they're just figuring out how these hormones were working. It was an ongoing process to figure out like how the hormones worked in the body and how we can manipulate them. So all of this is happening around the same time. So it's no wonder that we didn't really know how to manipulate things very well.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays you can at home in the privacy of your own bathroom pee on a little stick and see when you're having an LH surge. Yeah. But back then, when they were doing these initial cycles in England, they did have this new, they called it a higanovosis urine test. It was a hemagglutination test for LH that had come from Japan, and that's what was letting them see when the LH surge happens. But then when they were trying to do cycles in the US soon after the successful birth, they weren't able to get that magical serum from Japan. And so instead, what they would do is before a patient could even get ready for their egg retrieval, they would have to do 3 mock cycles first to try and figure out, okay, when do we think that egg is coming out? And then starting on day 10, they would monitor their cervical mucus score, their basal body temperature. They would have an abdominal ultrasound. They would do 24-hour urine tests. And as ovulation got closer, they would have blood samples drawn every 4 hours around the clock. So if you think your IVF cycle right now is invasive, imagine coming in for a blood draw every 4 hours to try and figure out when you might be ready for that actual procedure. Again, big deal, incisions in the abdomen, laparoscopic surgery, just to try and grab the ovary and suck out that one egg before it's actually spontaneously released.
Yeah, I mean, we think it's hard to plan our lives around when our egg retrieval is going to be now. Can you imagine just like doing all these blood work and like, okay, well, now we have to do the egg retrieval. Now we have to have a laparoscopy.
And also, embryology is like in its infancy, and they don't know a lot about what's good for embryos. So they were doing all of this at night. You talk about scheduling. So
yes,
because so almost like it's an accident, and these early ones happened at night, and like, oh, it must need, darkness for the embryo. So they were always performing the retrievals between 1 and 3 a.m. and then doing their transfers like just before midnight in the dim lighting.
And it's like, why? Like someone thought that was a possible thing. It just reminds me so much of like the humors and like hysteria and all that kind of stuff. Like our brains somehow thought X equaled Y in that kind of scenario.
Well, that's what they talk about in this article, was kind of, I mean, I think that the stuff in England is fascinating, but I think it's almost more interesting to see like how is IVF happening in the US, because you kind of had almost this fluke of this one successful cycle. And then it's interesting to look at how everybody else tried to mimic it. And that's where you see people finally starting to do a little bit of this experimentation, because in the US, they were trying to do exactly the same thing that they thought had been done in England. They're trying to do these natural cycles. They're trying to, simulate the same thing, but they're just not having any results. It's like, they're not getting a pregnancy. And so that's when they start saying, well, maybe we can play with some of these factors, but they didn't want to change everything all at once, because they point out if we had a pregnancy after we changed everything, we wouldn't know what was the important factor. So they kind of started shifting some things. And yeah, they mentioned on this that one of their the first successful IVF pregnancy in the US, that birth was in 1981. And because there had been a scheduling conflict, she ended up having her transfer at 11 a.m. And then they're like, oh, look at that. That worked. And so then they stopped having these like middle of the night transfers.
Thank goodness. So oh my gosh.
You need like these, almost accidental situations to finally like make you realize what parts are important, what parts are not. And that's something that's still happening with research right now.
Yeah, and you have to tweak little things, right, to be able to figure out what exactly it is. That it's definitely a thing in research too, because you don't want to overcompensate and then be like, okay, well, what did we change? We changed all these things. Which one is the thing that is the thing? And I think that brings up a good point too, is I don't know how many people realize that the first IVF cycle was not in the US.
Yeah.
And even before Louise Brown, there was a couple potential, like they had been trying and it just didn't work. There wasn't there like a potential like ectopic pregnancy before that.
Yeah, although they say maybe not, because it's also not confirmed. There were some eggs that had not been retrieved. This is back when they were still stimulating the ovaries. And so the thought is, well, maybe that pregnancy was from an egg that was floating around there, which goes into why we often tell our patients to abstain from intercourse when they're getting close to egg retrieval, because there can be some like loose floating eggs, and it's reproduction is messy in many ways. And so trying to control all those factors is a challenge, and seeing what they used to have to do in the past does make me really appreciate how much easier in some sense things are now.
And then our first IVF baby, which I don't know if her name is quite as recognizable. And if you're outside of the fertility world, we know who she is. Elizabeth Carr was the first IVF baby in the United States.
Yeah, she doesn't get the credit.
She doesn't get the credit. No.
Being first is the most important, right?
And then I think in between that, Australia had a success too. So
when we're talking about kind of the magic that had actually ever lined up for the Louise Brown birth, one of these articles mentioned some stats, which I thought was fascinating. So when they're looking at all the cycles they did between 1969 and then that 1978 pregnancy, that was 250 patients covering 457 cycles. They had 112 transfers. And then if you measure that against contemporary success rates, if you use the same data, that would give you about a 0.8% chance of pregnancy. And so again, this is almost one of those it just happened to work out that way. And so when they start mimicking all these things in the US and then tweaking and then finally going back to stimulating the ovaries, they're really excited when they get up to around a 10% success rate for pregnancy, because you can see if you started off with a less than 1% chance, that by the time you're a couple years later and you're saying that you could have a 10% chance of pregnancy, people are like thrilled with that. Yeah. And so although we wish the pregnancy rate was 100% right now, and it's hard for people when we're talking about things often being almost like a 50-50, that's still like a huge increase in really not all, in our lifespan, right? Yeah. That we've gone from this being something that almost never worked to something that actually works a good percentage of the time.
Yeah, the evolution of IVF has actually been, a lot has happened in a relatively short period of time. The transfers at first, in our work here, we've seen it from day 3 to day 5, and, but there is times where they're transferring on day 1.
Yeah.
Like fertilization, put it right back in there. So it was trial and error. So there was a lot of patience, a lot of eggs, a lot of cycles that went into this just to have the one success before the ball started rolling to really keep moving in this direction.
One of the other things I like that I think hasn't changed that much is you do get a sense in the articles of just, people were always understanding of the emotions involved. They tell a story about in the 1980s in the US, there was a snowstorm and they were having to everybody had to make it in at night to do the egg retrieval, and what an ordeal it was. And we've all worked the snowstorms, so that same thing.
I have been there for one of those.
And they talk about exactly being so impressed by the fact that upon identification of each egg, there was clapping and a feeling of excitement and euphoria. Aww. And I feel like we still get that even now in the OR. It's so gratifying when you're kind of calling out some numbers and realizing that, okay, we are getting eggs, this is something that's happening. And so that's something that's been consistent the whole time. But now we have a much higher chance of being happy at the end of it all too, which is great.
When I worked in the OR, I can recall on a couple of occasions when we were doing sperm extraction and we were like not sure if we were going to be successful or not. And we're like, and the lab would come to the window and be like, we got sperm. And like everybody was like, woo! Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if other industries, like when a mechanic fixes a car, is everyone like, woo, the battery works again? I don't think so. But maybe not.
Yeah.
So what did you want to say about what you think the future holds?
Oh, well, since we've had IVF, like I mentioned, we have had evolution and embryology, and that's ongoing too in terms of media and how we culture out embryos and how they survive, how we have been able to freeze embryos. And then, when I first started here, freezing eggs was experimental. So in that time, they're no longer experimental. We've perfected some of our techniques. So it's so ongoing. Also, since I've been here, we've had in the US, out of Cleveland, there have been successful uterine transplantation, which is crazy to think about, and pregnancies with uterine transplantation. And I think that's an ongoing area as well.
And ovarian tissue freezing.
Yes,
because that's the thing. Sometimes you have people where either maybe they're facing a medical diagnosis where we don't have, 10 to 12 days to stimulate the ovaries, or you have a child that hasn't gone through puberty yet. And so there's not a way to make eggs mature in the body, but we can freeze strips of ovarian tissue. And that was, something that at first, just like with IVF, it was kind of this idea, but there hadn't been any successful births. And now that there have been, you can reimplant those strips and you can get ovulation. And so there definitely are still a lot of things on the horizon. And it'll be interesting to see 40 years from now how different things might be compared to what we're doing.
Well, did you see the NPR article the other day about this startup, the lab-grown human eggs, where they're taking stem cells and trying to convert them into eggs, so potentially helping women that are either to the point where they don't have high quality eggs, or they're postmenopausal, or for whatever reason they don't have access to their eggs again. Potentially for same-sex couples, like maybe we can take a stem cell from the other partner and create an egg or a sperm cell from that, and then you can have genetic parentage. Who knows? It seems pretty early and new for that kind of stuff, but it's really interesting. And along with it, we have all of these new ethical discussions and political things. And yeah, it's like the same thing.
I was going to say, you have the same concerns. Are we creating this generation? And I mean, there's so many factors that are all circling each other, and it's hard to know how things are going to go out. The one last thing I wanted to mention too, that I hadn't realized before, how not only lucky they were to finally have a success in England, but how close they were to shutting down. Yeah. I hadn't realized that this all happened just before Steptoe was getting ready to retire. That, basically he retired then in September 1978, and there was no more IVF until 1980 in the UK. It was kind of like they had their clinic, and if they had really just got a few more months and never had that one magic cycle, there's a decent chance that the work might have just stalled out after he was done. And you really needed to have that one magical success to show other people that this really was a possibility. And I think that's what we're going to see in some of these other areas too, is that for, like you said, a long time, people didn't think that you could possibly have a successful birth with a transplanted uterus. And then once it's happened, then people start really trying to refine that process, because just like with IVF, we don't want it to be successful less than 1% of the time. We want it to be something where you can have that risk benefit, because even though we're not doing laparoscopic surgeries with 5-pound TVs, IVF is still really hard. And so if we have some way to make it easier physically or cheaper cost-wise, those are all these things that we're still trying to work on.
Yeah, and it shows just why we always say, in terms of IVF, things seem like they've happened very quickly, but overall, medicine, it seems pretty slow. And part of that is because every step of the way, we have to tweak things and move things around. We start at the cellular level, in the lab. Then we move on to animal studies and things like that. Before it actually gets to human studies, a lot has happened to get to that point. So we're talking years and years for just small tweaks in practice change and innovation.
So stay tuned in the future. And, kids that are running around and little right now will someday be talking about the good old days of when we used to like do IVF, and probably how barbaric it was that you had to give yourself all these injections instead of being able to just mature things in the laboratory. So,
yeah, or just do like a little ovarian biopsy or something and just like store the ovarian cells, or who knows. I could see it going a lot of different ways.
So yeah, I mean, history cycles, it's circular. Even Brave New World, the title comes from The Tempest, and Miranda saying, oh, Brave New World, it has such people in it. So yeah, we don't know what the new worlds are going to be like in the future. We don't know what science holds, but it was fun for me to look back and see how complicated things were, how lucky it really was that there was this one successful pregnancy, and, you know, we'll see what happens in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.